12,500 feet beneath the surface, the ocean's rule is absolute and merciless. Pressure crushes everything in its path without hesitation. When exploration teams deployed their ROVs into the darkest recesses of the ocean liner's hull, the command room braced to find a wasteland of twisted iron. But as the machines pushed deeper into the lower decks, toward the infamous Compartment F, their floodlights revealed a sight that stopped the oceanographers cold. They didn't find destruction. What the lenses captured was an armored mausoleum, a perfectly sealed pocket where the laws of physics simply broke down. What rests undisturbed behind those steel doors forces science to question everything it knows about the deep. When the public recalls that tragic April night in 1912, the imagination instantly travels upward. We picture the orchestra playing its final notes, the glittering crystal chandeliers, the unreachable luxury of first class. But the true heart of that mechanical colossus, the exact place where the most brutal and invisible fight for survival unfolded, lay far below the waterline. Hidden from every passenger's eyes, Compartment F operated as one of the ship's monumental watertight sections, engineered to ensure that the four-funneled steel giant would never go down. It was a harsh environment, a strictly technical zone dominated by the extreme heat of the furnaces, black soot, and claustrophobic corridors where access was tightly restricted. Down there, raw, back-breaking labor set the pace and rhythm of the crossing. But there was one fateful detail that the finest engineering minds of the era simply couldn't outrun. On that freezing glass-calm night, the lookouts in the crow's nest, working without binoculars to pierce the darkness of the horizon, spotted the iceberg far too late. And contrary to what most people assume, the impact that dealt the giant its death blow was not a violent head-on collision. The ship suffered a long, continuous sideways graze, a deep and deceptive wound that sliced through the starboard plates below the waterline. Within minutes, the ocean poured into the lower sections with an unstoppable, overwhelming force. And it was at that exact moment that the ship's senior officers triggered the vessel's ultimate emergency maneuver. With a deafening metallic crash that shook the entire lower structure, massive watertight doors dropped from their overhead tracks, driven purely by gravity, sealing off every passage. They operated like relentless guillotines of solid steel, cutting off the water's advance into other sections, but violently isolating Compartment F in the process. The extreme maneuver was meant to stop the bleeding of the hull, but it instantly transformed that section into a sealed vault. As the ocean liner's heavy bow began its slow plunge into the dark water, dragging everything toward the abyss long before the structure buckled and split in two, sending the stern to its final resting place, that isolated section began its own quiet journey to the bottom. For over a century, everything locked behind those heavy barriers remained in absolute, undisturbed darkness, shielded from ocean currents and completely hidden from curious lenses. For decades, history kept its spotlight trained on the lifeboat tragedies, leaving this intricate tomb forgotten in the muddy floor of the North Atlantic. Yet what modern explorers would discover when they finally navigated past the wreckage would completely rewrite everything we know about deep-sea preservation. And if you want to follow every risky step of this high seas investigation, go ahead and subscribe to our channel right now. Because what awaits our robots in the deep defies every rule of science. Accessing the sealed sections of Compartment F isn't just an engineering challenge, it's a full-blown tactical nightmare that pushes modern exploration technology to its absolute limits. We're talking about a submerged environment where pressure exceeds 5,800 pounds per square inch, an extremely hostile domain where sunlight has never dared to reach since that fateful April of 1912. To penetrate the deepest and darkest corners of the wreck, surface teams must deploy remotely operated vehicles, highly sophisticated machines carrying millions of dollars in hardware, and the enormous responsibility of unlocking the giant's last preserved secrets. The navigation begins slowly and precisely, with the ROVs descending silently through the gaps of the old, once luxurious elevator shafts, now nothing more than abysses of twisted metal, rust, and suffocating darkness. Every foot gained downward is a victory against the odds, because the liner's interior has become a three-dimensional maze of invisible dangers. But there was one terrifying detail that made this specific incursion far more dangerous than any previous expedition to the upper decks. The path to the isolated foundations requires the pilots, seated in the control room nearly 2.5 miles above on the surface, to maneuver their equipment through a zone of total chaos. The ROV's powerful directional floodlights cut through the freezing, murky water, exposing deadly obstacles around every tight corner. Thick electrical cables hang in the void like steel spiderwebs, ready to snare the robot's propellers at the slightest misstep. collapsed steel ceiling panels crushed under the overwhelming weight of the upper decks form highly unstable barricades threatening to give way in a chain reaction from the smallest contact or water vibration. And on top of all that, tons of debris and heavy equipment lie precariously piled across the floor, creating treacherous bottlenecks where an exploration vehicle could easily be trapped forever. It was at this critical moment that real tension gripped the entire operation. The pilots, guiding the machines with millimeter-precise movements and held breath, knew with absolute certainty that forcing entry through a narrow, jagged gap in the shattered hull could mean the immediate and irreversible loss of the vehicle. One miscalculation, one rushed maneuver, or even an unexpected push from a submarine current, and the thick umbilical cables connecting the ROV to the surface ship could snap, cutting the video feed and abandoning millions of dollars worth of technology to the dark forever. The financial and operational risk was simply astronomical, yet the historical and scientific prize seemed to justify pushing that far. The urgent need to discover whether anything had survived inside that isolated pocket, to prove whether the engineering of the era had truly created an intact sanctuary at the heart of the greatest maritime disaster in modern history, pushed the entire team to the very edge of what was considered safe. They had to cross that dangerous line and dive headfirst into the unknown. As the vehicle slowly approached the infamous compartment's coordinates, the ship's internal architecture began to shift dramatically on camera. The melancholy, ornate beauty of the upper decks gave way to the cold, purely functional industrial character of the heavy service areas. The containment walls, reinforced with double plates of solid steel, traced the imposing perimeter of a true submerged fortress. The surface team watched the monitors in heavy, reverent silence, fully aware they were invading a technical space that had seen no human movement or breath for more than a century. With every inch the robot advanced, scraping gently against the severely deteriorated metal hull, the claustrophobia grew more intense. This wasn't a routine archaeological survey, it was an aggressive invasion of a time capsule sealed by pressure and buried by time. To finally reach the entrance, the ROV had to perform unnatural maneuvers, carefully squeezing through jagged gaps that the collapse of the upper floors had torn open around the main passage. The ancient dust settled over the dead structures slowly rose with the gentle vibration of the ROV's thrusters, creating dense clouds that reduced visibility to nearly zero. Every second of visual blindness on the monitors brought the constant fear of a fatal strike against an unseen beam. But as part of that dark underwater haze finally cleared, the floodlights locked onto the colossal metal barriers protecting the isolated area. The submersible had survived its near-suicidal descent and now sat perfectly positioned, face to face with the steel sentinels guarding the interior. Tension in the command center hit its peak, because what rested just behind those impenetrable walls was seconds away from being illuminated, and it would change everything science thought it knew. When the ROV's powerful floodlights finally swept through the dense darkness and lit up the exact perimeter of Compartment F's entrance, what the high-definition lenses captured on the control screens was not simply a testament to the grandeur of early 20th century naval engineering. What emerged from the ancient ocean mud was the definitive and completely silent visual proof of the most desperate human act. The cameras slowly closed in on the colossal watertight doors, true walls of solid steel weighing dozens of tons, resting violently driven into the ship's structural floor. They were there, unmoved and coated in sediment, like metal scars from a primary defense system that fulfilled its mechanical purpose exactly as designed. On that freezing night, triggered by gravity and the emergency command from the bridge, they slammed shut like massive, immovable guillotines to hold back the ocean's relentless invasion. The wound inflicted by that lethal sideways graze against the iceberg, but the overwhelming and anguishing image of those permanently locked barriers carries a dark historical weight that is almost unbearable for any oceanographer who understands the dynamics of that night. The technical perfection and the sheer finality with which that structural isolation occurred proves, in a cold and unquestionable way, that the entire area was sealed while dozens of men were still fighting desperately inside. These were not passengers resting comfortably in their luxury cabins, shielded by ignorance of the danger. They were stokers, technical engineers, and heavy machinery operators, the true backbone of strength keeping the Colossus breathing, heated, and moving. When the mechanical alarm screamed through the industrial corridors and the heavy bulkheads dropped with a deafening crash of metal against metal, the fate of that entire operational crew was brutally sealed. The very high-strength steel that had been forged to guarantee the vessel's absolute safety became, in a single instant, an abyssal prison with absolutely no way out. Have you ever stopped to truly grasp the full psychological terror of that moment and felt that inevitable chill down your spine imagining a complete absence of escape in a space being swallowed by the sea? Far from the world's eyes and completely cut off from the chaotic panic of the open decks above, these essential men remained trapped in total darkness. As the freezing water invaded the confined space slowly and relentlessly, rising past their ankles, knees, and waists, they kept working with a level of loyalty and duty that transcends every basic instinct of self-preservation. The desperate focus of that crew was not to find a miracle escape from inevitable death, but to stay fixed on the heavy machinery. They needed to keep the massive suction pumps running and the giant electrical generators alive for a few more precious, counted minutes. They surrendered their lives to the darkness to ensure the power didn't fail, that the lights on the upper decks stayed on, preventing total chaos and buying the deck officers just enough time to lower the lifeboats into the dark water. It was a heroic and completely anonymous sacrifice made behind thick walls that would never open to freedom. To step back and fully grasp the true magnitude of this claustrophobic tragedy hidden in the liner's foundations, we need to pull the explorers' cameras back for a moment and take in the external scene. We need to observe the monumental wreck resting in the haunting silence of the ocean floor. The entire massive forward half of the legendary four-funneled vessel, which first plunged agonizingly by the bow before its structure surrendered to gravity, violently splitting in two and sending the heavy stern section to its own fate, now lies like a formidable rusted mountain. It is a dramatic silhouette surrounded by miles of the most absolute and inhospitable underwater void. The vast openness and deathly stillness of that external debris field contrast brutally with the contained panic and violent claustrophobia that consumed the narrow engineering bays during the sinking. The silence of the abyss now hides the desperate echoes of a space once dominated by the industrial roar of the furnaces and the agonizing groan of the hull surrendering to the forces of nature. And when the exploration team's attention, through the cold light of the ROVs, returned to the untouched details locked inside that dead-end corridor, the texture of the twisted metal began revealing the true extent of what that isolation had done. Compartment F was not simply a flooded industrial chamber, it was an inviolable vault that devoured and immortalized the final working hours of an entire crew. Yet there was an even more frighteningly fascinating detail hidden in the deepest shadows of that mechanical tomb. The exact airtight way in which those watertight doors contained the violent rush of salt water created a physical side effect that no naval architect or modern scientist could have ever imagined. And what the robot's focused beam would find just a few feet ahead, in the middle of total destruction, would leave the surface team completely speechless, setting the stage for an impossible discovery. As the ROVs pushed past the massive containment barriers that sealed the technical crew's fate, their floodlights swept the interior of Compartment F, revealing a scene that instantly defied the basic logic of structural destruction. What truly silenced the experienced researchers in the command center miles away was not the grandeur of the ruined engineering, but a brutal and completely incomprehensible paradox that emerged from the submerged chaos. Have you ever studied an old photograph and felt that chill run down your spine when you notice a detail that simply shouldn't be there? Something that breaks every rule of expected normalcy? That is the exact unsettling sensation that gripped the entire historical recovery operation when the thick underwater dust finally settled. Inside this zone of heavy machinery and old cargo holds, where tons upon tons of high-strength steel beams had been chewed up, twisted, and bent like flimsy aluminum cans under the ocean's crushing force, the high-definition lenses locked onto physical absurdities that were nearly intolerable to conventional science. The landscape of violent annihilation that everyone expected to find after the descent to the bottom had given way to a terrifying display of untouched fragility, creating an atmosphere of thick, palpable suspense that echoed across every monitoring screen of the expedition. The heavy iron tools, once used routinely by the hands-on maintenance crew to tame the roaring furnaces and complex valves of the great four-funneled ocean liner, rested in perfect alignment on the sediment-covered black floor. They appeared to have been carefully and methodically set aside at the end of an exhausting work shift that, tragically, never saw its morning. But an even more disturbingly anomalous detail was waiting in the deep shadows of that engineering tomb, alongside the thick steel that had buckled miserably under the force of the water during the bow's vertiginous plunge. Long before the structure split in two and the heavy stern drove to its destiny, primary mechanical pressure gauges fitted with incredibly thin and delicate glass faces remained absolutely intact. The monumental housing of one of the suction pumps displayed its crystal-clear viewing windows without a single crack, reflecting the ROV's cold, artificial beam like ghostly mirrors lost in the immensity of the deep. And it was at this moment of surgical exploration that Compartment F's greatest enigma revealed itself in its full, impossible glory, silencing the oceanography team completely. It is critical to remember that the fatal blow that condemned the vessel was not a head-on strike of instant annihilation, but a continuous, sneaking sideways graze, an extensive wound that allowed the waters to invade in a very specific way. Resting almost lazily on the ancient black mud lining the sealed room's metal floor, thin glass storage bottles lay motionless and perfectly intact. In any rigorous theoretical simulation, those containers should have violently imploded and turned to microscopic dust under the brutal weight of nearly 6,000 pounds per square inch of pressure. It is a paralyzing cognitive shock for any specialist to observe such vulnerable vessels surviving unscathed in the very place where the most formidable steel forged by the naval industries of the early 20th century collapsed spectacularly without offering any meaningful resistance. This is the exact moment where our investigation reaches its peak tension and its narrative breaking point. The structural bridge where documented history collides head-on with the immutable laws of deep-water physics. The presence of these untouched glass relics at the magnetic epicenter of the naval disaster is not just a picturesque visual anomaly preserved in the belly of the sea. It is an aggressive enigma demanding immediate answers, and it completely changes the course of what we know about structural behavior in extreme shipwrecks. How does a simple, fragile glass bottle survive in a technical room where solid steel was obliterated by the titanic forces of nature? What truly happened during those final desperate minutes of agony, right after the heavy guillotine doors slammed shut without mercy, that allowed this technical sector to shield its most sensitive pieces from the crushing fury of the deep? The scientific answer to this monumental riddle, revealed next, uncovered a breathtaking phenomenon and rewrote the books of ocean engineering forever. The definitive answer to this brutal enigma, the one that left the oceanographers frozen in front of their monitors, lies in an extraordinary and terribly accidental physical phenomenon. How exactly does a simple glass bottle survive intact in the very environment where the world's most robust steel foundations were crushed like paper? To crack this mechanical riddle and understand the true tragic genius of this submerged tomb, we need to pull our investigative lens away from the twisted wreckage for a moment and take in the full picture of that monumental collapse. We need to visualize the agony of the four-funnel giant from an external perspective, giving our exploration a visual breath of fresh air before we plunge into the climax of the discovery. On that freezing night, following the fatal sideways graze that wounded the vessel's flanks in a long, creeping gash, a wound the night lookouts couldn't anticipate due to the unfortunate absence of binoculars at their elevated watch post, the ocean liner's fate was sealed. The dynamics of that sinking were terrifying. The Colossus began to be consumed mercilessly bow first, tilting its massive structure forward and lifting the enormous stern into the dark air until the colossal, unsustainable weight caused the metal hull to violently split in two. Yet while the two gigantic halves of the ship began their long, dramatic, and chaotic descent toward 12,500 feet below, Compartment F experienced a parallel reality, completely isolated from the exterior chaos. And it was at that exact moment of vertiginous freefall through the unexplored abyss that the pressure anomaly began to take shape in silence. When the desperate orders from the bridge sent the monumental watertight doors crashing down their tracks, they fulfilled their mechanical role with brutal efficiency, isolating the heroic technical crew and cutting off the ocean's rapid advance. The problem is that while those heavy iron guillotines were formidable barriers against a massive and immediate flood, they did not make that space 100% airtight, like the interior of a modern combat submarine. As the heavy lower section of the ship sank mile after mile into the freezing darkness, the crushing force of the seawater found microscopic gaps in the sealing joints and in the primary structural deformations caused by the stress of the metal giving way to the initial impact. But there was a crucial and invisible detail unfolding inside that locked steel box. The saltwater's invasion of Compartment F happened in an incredibly slow and gradual manner, filling the enclosed space at a rate almost precisely proportional to the speed at which the ship plunged into the open ocean. And that changes absolutely everything that classical science predicted about crush destruction at abyssal depths. Instead of suffering a sudden and explosive collapse upon reaching the most oppressive and lethal layers of the North Atlantic, where the weight of the water column surpasses a staggering 5,800 pounds per square inch, the internal environment began to equalize. The pressure inside the isolated room steadily matched the crushing pressure on the outside, second by second, drop by drop. That constant, naturally calibrated infiltration transformed that vast engineering bay into an accidental hyperbaric chamber of epic proportions. By the time the enormous iron hull finally struck the ocean floor with a catastrophic kinetic impact, shattering master beams and bending cargo platforms like hot wax, the internal pressure of Compartment F was already perfectly identical to the extreme pressure of the abyss. The thick, robust steel of the outer hull absorbed and dissipated all of the destructive kinetic energy from the violent collision against the ancient ocean mud entirely on its own, acting heroically as a gigantic sacrificial shield. While the heavy outer walls twisted in a final and deafening mechanical agony, the dark, fully flooded, and perfectly equalized interior remained in a state of near-peaceful physical suspension. The absolute absence of a pressure differential completely eliminated the possibility of a catastrophic implosion on the smaller objects inside. The brutal, invisible forces pushing relentlessly against the glass from the outside were now perfectly matched and neutralized by the same forces filling and supporting it from within. That is the astonishing, cold, and completely counterintuitive reason why the delicate gauges and thin storage bottles floated or rested in absolute safety at the very epicenter of total annihilation. This steel tomb became an undeniable scientific paradox, proving to the world's most experienced researchers that, under the most extreme and improbable physical conditions of a shipwreck, the breathtaking fragility of a simple glass container can outlast the irreparable fall of a true empire of metal. This is the true apex of our exploration, the exact and fascinating instant in which an immeasurable tragedy forged an absolute miracle of physics in the most inhospitable and darkest place on Earth. The revelation of that unlikely miracle of physics brought brief relief to the expedition's tension, but the true emotional impact of the Compartment F invasion was still hidden in the deepest shadows of that submerged tomb. When the experienced pilots in the command room adjusted the ROV's floodlight beam to scan the steel floor, carpeted in thick, ancient sediment, the research team was hit by a paralyzing, emotional blow. In the middle of the black ocean mud and the vast coal scattered from the old furnaces, the high-definition lenses illuminated, beyond any doubt, the human cost of that immense maritime tragedy. But there was a hauntingly melancholy detail waiting in the extreme darkness. The raking light exposed dozens of pairs of heavy leather boots and sturdy work shoes, arranged in a tragically organized fashion across the severely deteriorated deck plates. In an abyssal environment where the ocean's unforgiving force had consumed everything organic over the decades, the leather used in those work boots displayed a near astonishing resilience. Its chemical composition, derived from the rigorous industrial tanning process of that era, makes that material completely immune to the voracious microorganisms that relentlessly consume the massive steel structures of the four-funneled giant from port to starboard. And that completely changes our perception of that silent graveyard of heavy machinery. Those boots are not randomly scattered in the corners like debris swept around by violent underwater currents during the Colossus's long fall after the fatal sideways graze against the ice. They rest undisturbed in the exact spot where the brave stokers and engineers were fighting at their emergency stations. Each pair marks the precise square foot where a member of the heroic technical crew surrendered to exhaustion and the freezing sea, moments after the colossal metal guillotines dropped and locked them in absolute darkness. The sophisticated submersible illuminated true, silenced grave markers, the final witnesses to the anonymous heroes of the ship's foundations. Yet this moving and perfectly preserved scene holds a silent, inevitable countdown. An imminent threat that will very soon destroy this mechanical vault completely and without return. The haunting images captured by the ROVs inside Compartment F are precious to history for one terrible and unavoidable reason. They have an incredibly short shelf life. What the lenses recorded is not an armored mausoleum frozen in time, but an environment being brutally attacked at this very second. If we step back visually and observe the external hull of the four-funneled giant, the full scale of the natural disaster reveals itself without mercy. The entire ceiling and thick steel walls of this lower section are being devoured without pity by iron-eating bacteria, a microscopic army weakening the structure every single day. But there was an even more alarming detail flagged by the specialists. Because the ocean liner plunged violently bow first and suffered severe structural damage when it broke in two after the fatal sideways graze against the ice, the upper decks are now pressing down on the lower floors with a near unsustainable deadweight. The expedition that shocked the world by uncovering this physical miracle will most likely be the last to have ever seen that sealed room with such clarity. It is only a matter of very little time before all the decks collapse completely, crushing and burying the true steel tomb and its ghosts irreversibly in the total darkness of the abyss. The merciless ocean proved once and for all that it does not destroy history equally. Behind the fallen heavy doors of Compartment F, exploration teams did not find a dark void annihilated by pressure, but a cruel and perfectly preserved photograph of the most absolute despair lived in that tragic April of 1912. The mechanical terror of those locked steel guillotines, contrasting brutally with the breathtaking delicacy of intact glass gauges, laid bare for the world that extreme tragedy and physical preservation can, paradoxically, share the exact same space in the darkness. This isolated and dying section of the four-funneled giant is the silent proof that the most disturbing answers are almost always buried where no one has the courage to look. If you want to keep uncovering the great mysteries of our past, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss our next historical investigation.